you take your logo off of your content, right? Would you know it was yours? If it wasn't branded with your name, it didn't have your logo on it, right? Well, just take all that stuff off and then look at it with fresh eyes. Do you look like everybody else? Do you sound like everybody else? Is it the same messages, the same word choice and tone? Even without the visual elements in the naming, right? And if the answer is no, then before you create any other kinds of content, I think the next step does have to be that planning and thinking really critically about what are we giving people? What are we saying that is different? And how can we say it in a way that really sounds like us, true?
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Hey, B2B DM gang, I'm excited. We're going to have a great discussion today because I've already started it a little bit. So, when we start talking about the difference in B2B and B2C and marketing and connection and differentiation, we're going to have some great insights into that because we have Margie Agin on the show with us today. Margie, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, and hi to the B2B gang.
Yes. Okay, so Margie is the author. Of course, she's going to give us a little bit more understanding of her skill and background in this area, but she is the author of Brand Breakthrough. And I'm actually going to read the subtitle because it's a little bit more than I can remember off the top of my head. It's Brand Breakthrough, How to Go Beyond a Catchy Tagline and Build an Authentic, Influential, and Sustainable Brand Personality. So Margie, tell us a little bit about your background and experience into that topic and title and what you're going to share with us today.
Sure, absolutely. It's kind of ironic because I never would have considered myself a brand marketer, right? And I think my background is more market research and sort of the unglamorous side of marketing, right? Like kind of boots on the ground, almost grassroots kind of marketing. And I always sort of thought of brand marketing as kind of the like very glamorous, sort of sexy Mad Men kind of side of marketing. And what I found in kind of my career as I started from market research, then I went into demand gen and content marketing for a variety of B2B tech companies. What I found was often the brand was sort of delivered from the top echelon of the marketing team, and maybe the CEO, maybe an external agency that they brought on board, right? Kind of delivered from above from that group to the rest of the organization in a very kind of umbrella, broad brand statement that sounds super pretty, right? Like truth in action, or, we connect the dots, or something that is, very maybe aspirational, but broad, but then, and the brand personality and the brand attributes of the company and all these very important and wonderful things, but then kind of left up to the rest of the organization to kind of absorb and interpret and figure out how to actually use in their day-to-day work, whether that's the marketer who has to write the email, or craft copy for the website, or the salesperson that then has to present this, beautiful looking presentation that doesn't have a ton of meat behind it. And so I found myself kind of frustrated, I guess, when I was in charge of writing copy for a website, for example, because I just didn't have enough information to kind of fill in those gaps and fill in the blank page. So when I started working on this book and really kind of building centerboard marketing in general, I looked at how do we fill that gap in? What's kind of the missing piece, and how do we start to close that gap between the brand marketing side, right, and really tangible kind of marketing and sales tactics that reflect the brand, amplify the brand, right, are consistent with the brand, but help people actually do their jobs day to day, so that they don't have to try to recreate and guess at what that is and spend all that time. And so that's basically what that book is about, how to close that gap. And also what my business is about is trying to, create pathways and kind of connections between a high level brand personality and actionable, sustainable marketing tactics.
And we're going to get into a little bit more detail on that, because I mean, as you're talking, I'm like, okay, I can see how that fits. But then you see the parts of the organization start having this struggle of features and benefits, and then, storytelling, and it just gets kind of crazy. And I think one of the things that you talk about very early in the book is that because of what you had stated, in addition, because of people wanting to do a good job, people trying to help the organization to stand out, and ultimately what we're talking about is to generate revenue, attract clients, retain clients and customers, and all of that, is we start having this, as you call it, content marketing junk pile that's created. So what do you exactly mean by that?
Yeah, content marketing, as it started, trending over maybe the last 10 years or so, right? It very much in the beginning of this trend was about create more, feed the beast. The Google search engines just want constant newness, right? And people have 7, 8 touch points. And so you just have to keep feeding them information. And the focus is very much on the quantity, right? Volume and speed. And that has led to a lot of junk content, right? Stuff that just goes out there, but doesn't really add to the conversation, right? Or looks the same as what everybody else creates. Many websites and blogs and social media and podcasts that start off and then become ghost towns because they're not sustainable, right? And it's people are sort of glazing over all that stuff now because there's just so much we're overwhelmed, and marketing teams can't keep up, right? So the shift really has to be just stop adding to this marketing junk pile and truly can take a hard look and consider if this content, let's say you're creating a new ebook or you've got a blog or a newsletter or something. Yes, it's important to create on a consistent basis, but it doesn't need to be daily or it doesn't need to be weekly if you don't have just to fill the gap, right? It's got to be something that ideally your readers wouldn't see anywhere else, something that shows some kind of unique or helpful or controversial, intriguing perspective, right? And that really we take the time to have our content reflect our brand, reflect what we want people to know about us. If it doesn't, it doesn't move the needle, right? And can even do more damage to our brand than if we didn't put it at all.
Well, as you were talking, and I started looking at some of the statistics associated with this whole content, let's just call it a tsunami, and when you think about just the natural, phenomena of a tsunami, it doesn't care what's in its path, right? It's going to level and destroy anything and everything, no matter how strongly it was built, if the tsunami is strong enough. So I could be out there saying, and many people could be listening to this and saying, we don't create junk content. We do stand out. We do create unique stuff. We're good at what we do. And you know what? They may be, but yet they're still getting leveled because there is just so much. You can't break free from the freaking storm.
I think it's something like 70%, at least of B2B content, right? That never even gets used, never gets seen. And I've definitely seen many websites, is extremely common, I think, in both B2B and B2C, where maybe maybe 5%, right, of the articles of the pages on the website get the vast majority of the traffic, right? And we've probably all seen this, where there's some blog from 2017 that is still right? Maybe because it's been out there longer, or because it's gotten lots of traffic over time, or it's still a hot topic, right? And that sucker is still our number one, right, link, and our number one performing content, and yet we keep creating more. So we're almost competing against ourselves now. And so instead of creating more, right, if we kind of take a step back and we look at, all right, well, let's take that 2017 blog, right? Can we take advantage of that old link, right? And maybe refresh that, take advantage of the fact that it still gets lots of eyeballs and traffic, and say, well, 50% of this is actually still really good stuff, but now I would also say this and this and this and this, right? And add it and extend it and add links to that from that page to other pages, and just more kind of strategically use what we've already done in this iceberg of content, and rather than just add more.
Well, and part of that too is kind of understanding and knowing your data. So I'll give you a quick one you'll probably get a good chuckle at. Is I had a particular page on my site that was just getting some crazy, out of ordinary type of traffic, and so I was like, hey man, we need to take this content, we need to do something with it, and repurpose it, and add to it, and do some interlinking, and try to get links going to it. And I found out it was one little icon graphic we made that was really driving all the attention.
That's funny. As long as it's not Russian bots, So
I've had that happen too.
I know. Right. Just looking at that data and actually saying, what are people interested in? Like, let's actually use that as our key.
They wanted my darn icon. They didn't want the content.
Yeah. So I guess connecting that back to sort of the brand personality, right? I'm not the only one to say this, right? But if you take your logo off of your content, right? Would you know it was yours? If it wasn't branded with your name, it didn't have your logo on it, right? Well, just take all that stuff off and then look at it with fresh eyes. Do you look like everybody else? Do you sound like everybody else? Is it the same messages, the same word choice and tone, even without the visual elements in the naming, right? And if the answer is no, then before you create any other kinds of content, I think the next step does have to be that planning and thinking really critically about what are we giving people? What are we saying that is different? And how can we say it in a way that really sounds like us, truthfully sounds like our company, our culture coming through before people ever get a chance to meet us, right? They're seeing us several times online, and they're probably going to interact with multiple different people, in a B2C sale in particular, B2B sale in particular, right? So how do we kind of put forth a brand for our company that is recognizable through all these different touch points and consistent? And to do that really takes, again, like that next layer beyond that big catchy tagline, and a lot of communication and examples and training to sort of diffuse that brand throughout the organization and get that buy-in from all the different people who ultimately are your ambassadors to your customers and frontline people who are having those conversations and crafting those emails so they can carry the torch.
So if we start talking about brand personality and specifically looking at B2B, what are some of you've given us some things from, telling the story and the situation. But to be a little bit more succinct, kind of give us a quick walkthrough of a couple of things that a B2B organization can do in order to be able to have a differentiating personality. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah. So a lot of companies, B2B companies, think of a personality or brand personality, I think, as a B2C kind of thing, right? That's something that, consumers care about and maybe business buyers don't care about. So it's the first thing to sort of tackle is maybe debunking that myth that brand personality is not for B2B.
And so in the book, you started talking about archetypes a little bit. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I think archetypes, for anyone who's kind of familiar with, like even tarot cards, right? Archetypes are something that is sort of in our consciousness just as human beings, whether we're B2B folk or B2C folk, right? It's something that we all kind of get just from watching movies and TV and reading books, is that there's these certain characters that keep coming up And when we see these characters in what we read or what we see, we kind of instantly attribute a certain sort of personality type to them. So, for example, an archetype might be a magician, right? Or it could be a jester who's very funny. It could be a rebel, who sort of takes on the unknown in a very aggressive way, or a pioneer who's doing something for the first time. And in the book, I give a lot of different examples of companies that are both on the B2C and the B2B side that have kind of embodied these different brand archetypes. And as a company kind of, or a marketing leader, look at these different examples, you can then kind of reflect back at your own organization and say, yeah, this is kind of the personality. These are the values, the ways that they speak, the ways that they put themselves forth in the world, right? That I kind of align myself with. You may consider.
Okay, so hold on one second. Yeah. I think with what you're talking right there, it's really important to note because we're talking about that cultural connection, and that we're trying to find that alignment and that congruency so that when someone's outside, they're looking in, it kind of all matches. And I'll give you a quick story of one that just kind of threw me for a loop. It was this technology company that when you look at them from a perception, you're like, hey, these people are, buttoned up, professional. They took that conservative, approach, and, they're really professional. And then they actually released some type of series where they were spoofing Star Wars and had these dorky battles, with these kids' lightsabers. I'm like, dudes, you just messed up. There's no congruency and alignment. And what I may have thought of you prior to do business with you, I'm now confused.
You're not confused. Yeah. And I think some companies think, oh, well, now if I'm going on Twitter or something, or social media, like I have to be catchy, right? Because that format is a little bit more light than maybe my buttoned up personality. But to that extreme, it can be very, very jarring, right? That's why archetypes like the jester, which would do something like that, it's really hard to sustain. You can't just sort of do it with a summer intern and say, we're going to try one funny campaign and then go right back up to our buttoned up selves, right? So I completely agree. And I think part of kind of expressing and developing a brand personality is really self-discovery. And looking and talking with people within your organization, especially if you have these different kind of silos and pockets of people, to really understand what is the culture of this organization. And then we can talk about, well, how do we bring that forward to the external world? So one of the exercises in the book, and there's a number of different kind of frameworks and activities that people can do, but one of the very first things is sort of that cultural kind of hierarchy or prioritization of different cultural brand attributes. And a key aspect of that exercise is prioritization and making difficult choices and looking at nuances. Like I had one company that I worked with, it was an educational technology company for preschoolers. So they wanted to be they wanted to be joyful, right? They wanted to be happy and joyful. But they didn't want to be jokey and funny. And so we spent a lot of time talking about sort of the spectrum, right? Of what is too far as like jokey and funny, but what is just right in terms of being like playful and joyful. And what are the words that really fit and feel like something we would truly say, right? If we were actually talking to one of our clients, what would we actually say? And sometimes people get wrapped around the axle when they then have to then put those words on a website or in content because they feel like that's sort of a different format. But it's the same sort of idea where your content also has to reflect what you truly might actually say and what would sound like you. So we spent a lot of time on words and word choice and different nuances of different words and what they might mean, so that we can give lots of examples then for folks that are creating content on social or any other kind of platform to say, yeah, this is how I might reflect that brand personality in my content.
Yeah, I think for me, oftentimes, there's a particular rebuttal that you oftentimes would get when you're starting to go through those types of activities and exercises where you're trying to get that alignment. And people would say, well, that's just semantics. And I'm like, no, there's a lot more to the depth and the meaning. And, you talked about nuances, and you talked about, breadth and depth. And this is not slighted work in any way, shape, or form, and oftentimes can be extremely difficult. However, yet it's vital when you start talking about the transformation process. Now, and also too, when I started thinking about this and getting this connection right, both internally and externally, and I started going through the book, and I'm like, well, it isn't really what we're trying to do from a transformation perspective to get the organization to become more emotionally intelligent. I mean, you talked about self-awareness. We talked about, how our projection is. We talked about, empathy you have in the book, all of these types of things. I mean, to me, I think it's really emotional intelligence that we're trying to boost and then therefore sustain, right?
Yeah, that's such a great term, emotional intelligence, and tapping into even B2B buyers' kind of emotional decision making, right? Of course, they're using logic and ROI calculations, but especially in B2B, I think one of the biggest emotions is fear, right? Fear of change. And so one of the biggest competitors is status quo and just doing nothing. So to really drive that urgency and trigger behavior change, we have to tap into emotions, and we have to tap into the pain that our customers are having, and make that pain and potential gain greater than the fear that they may be feeling, right? So yeah, one piece is the emotional intelligence of really understanding yourself, right? And being willing to take even an external view at yourself and a hard look at yourself, what you really are good at, what you're not, where you should be competing, where you shouldn't be, how you shouldn't be positioning yourself versus, where you really stand out. And then that emotional connection, closing that gap with your customers to understand what matters to them most, right? They've got a lot of different problems. So what's the one thing that, is going to, that it really is going to drive their action, right? And then when you can marry up your own differentiators with your customer's greatest pain, right? That's your sweet spot. And you add in, all right, well, now let's look at our competitors and say, well, is this really different? Is this really something else that nobody else can solve? If we didn't exist, what would our customers do instead? And if the answer to that is like, oh, well, we would just use X, Y, and Z, then, that's not a very compelling reason. So it has to be something that really they cannot get anywhere else, or they can't get with the same degree of value anywhere else. So the framework essentially is matching up those sort of three pillars of the stool, which is your own self-discovery and authentic culture, your customer's greatest pains, right? Because you have to be relevant to them, or what you're selling doesn't matter. And then a differentiating quality that truly is unique to your organization. And it could be many different things. It doesn't have to be a product or a feature. It could be a part of your personality, right? What it's like to work with you. It could be an approach. It could be many different aspects, but something that they're getting from you they can't get anywhere else.
As you're talking, I started thinking about, the book and the way that you actually went through the transformation process. And I think that's critically important. So if I'm sitting here and I want to be, a brand that actually has, the ability to, stand out and to break through, walk us through that process.
Yeah. So if we kind of look at those sort of three different pillars, and then there's a number of different questions and exercises and kind of case studies within the book. So just to sort of give a little mini, snapshot of that. So internally, let's kind of start there. It's critically important if you're a large enough company that you have different parts of your organization, right? To kind of get a sense of what different people inside are experiencing and believe the organizational culture truly is. So could be the product team, product marketing team, salespeople who are in the field, right? And have been with the company a long time, interacting with customers, customer service people, but important to get those people in a room and listening to each other and even debating some of these tricky kinds of subjects together, so that you get their buy-in from the beginning, and also you get just a more authentic view of the organization. So that's, those kinds of workshops and kind of brand attribute kind of frameworks and pyramids kind of help you make those tough choices to say, you come out of that room saying, all right, we're a company that's, whatever you choose those attributes to be, nimble, right? Or it could be more rebellious. And we could consider ourselves like a very aggressive upstart, disruptor. And we think of ourselves as one of those archetypes, like the rebel. So then you kind of have that sense of who you are. The next step is really talking with customers and finding out what they say about you when you're not in the room. So getting sort of that authentic view from their voice, the words that they choose, right? The way they've made their decisions, ultimately how they define the value that you play in their lives. Talking with them in a really honest way. I have different frameworks where I kind of take it from the from the perspective of the buyer persona, where instead of how many companies start sort of their sales processes, they say, all right, well, we want to talk about this first, right? And then we're going to show them this next piece and they're going to take a demo. And then in the third part of the sales cycle, they're going to, get a how-to document. And it's extremely focused from the perspective of what the company wants to do and how they think the sales cycle is going to go, right? So the reverse of that is taking it from the customer perspective and sort of, let's look at the buyer's journey before you ever enter the room, right? They've got a context that they're living in, a world that they're living in, well before you ever enter their world. So let's take it from their perspective, right? What are the questions that they ask at every point of the journey? What are the needs that they have? What are the alternatives that they're considering, right? What are the worries and obstacles they need to overcome? And when you hear those things, you take all that back in so that you can reflect that understanding and empathy back to them in your process and in the content that you present. So we kind of have to flip the perspective to start first with the buyer and what they're expressing and the world they're going through.
Yeah, definitely identifying the gaps between your journey and the buyer journey is, that's not an easy path.
It's not. It takes a lot of time, and it's a continuous learning process, right? So this idea that we should always be talking to customers, and so many marketers don't go out on sales calls, right? Or maybe do the occasional case study with the super happy customer, but never talk to the unhappy ones, right? We got to talk to the unhappy ones too, and start hearing all those different kind of stories, and it's all constant learning process.
Well, and even for me, when you say unhappy, there's some people who could be totally happy because of what you're doing, but yet they're a pain in the arse in order to be able to serve, right? And I even had somebody who was asking me about what you're talking and referring to, from a client perspective. And I said, and he said, I'll give you the opportunity to talk to some of our clients. We were talking about a business partnership and a relationship. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, but I don't want to talk to the ones that are just going to jump in front and want to talk about you because they're totally happy. I said, I want to talk to the ones who you think are the most difficult to be able to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to see how you're able to perform with organizations that just, they're just not easy to get along with. I mean,
yeah. Everyone has those.
Yeah. I mean, we all do. And I would dare to say, when you start looking at the landscape, the ones who are not happy, they're going to go away, but you still have some ones that linger and they stay for some reason. Maybe you're trying to keep them because of, profit margins, or because of whatever share, the share of wallet that you have in other I mean, there's a slew of so many different reasons why that could be the case.
And those might be issues that have nothing to do with you. Right?
Exactly.
So if they're sticking around, they're probably sticking around for some reason, and understanding what it is that, despite the fact that maybe there's some rockiness, right? Obviously there's some value there.
Yes.
It's being exchanged. So if we really understand what that is, then we can replicate that, right, with other with other companies and kind of lean into that in our marketing messages.
Because I think we run away from those customers, but if you look at it by and large, it's probably an 80-20 rule where 80% of our customers probably fall in that, oh, they're just hard to deal with realm, especially in B2B, because B2B, for a lot of organizations, the purchase decision wasn't made by the people who are actually working with the product and the solution and services, day in, week out, month after month.
And that's why when we talk about interviewing customers or talking in a B2B world, right, and having these different personas, right, you could go through that exact same framework for the buyer versus the actual user, right, versus the technical decision maker versus the buying decision maker, and then ultimately, possibly your C-level person. So, having these different kinds of personas, it's really core to marketing, but I would say too, it's very different in a B2B world than a B2C world, right? Because a B2C persona is often like, oh, John is, 24 and has disposable income and plays golf on the weekends and, has a dog, right? But in a B2B world, we care about like, what options has John considered before, right? And what would help John get internal buy-in for the decision? Like, these are tough questions, but there's no sense, I think, doing a persona that it is sort of this very high level, similar to the brand personality, right? It won't get used. It's not going to be helpful. So we have to go deeper to ask these tough questions so that we truly can come up with something that shows that empathy, right? And really kind of connects into the pain of the customer. And it has to be deeper in a B2B kind of storytelling. You've got to understand the characters in your story. So one character in the story is your own brand archetype, right? The rebel or the magician. And the other character is your buyer, where we've got, the more that we can understand them and what moves them along in their plot of the story, then we can help to move that story along.
Okay, so when I start, looking at that transformation process, I start looking at embarking on that process. When I start thinking even about the buyer journey, I start thinking about the complexity and change that has occurred in the past, couple of years. How much more difficult has this become?
To try to define your brand personality or to connect with the customer.
Exactly, to do that and to break through.
Well, differentiation is vital, right? Because I think it has become easier for both B2B and B2C buyers to switch vendors, right? In the last year with so much change. I think we've heard something like digital transformation is like jumped forward 7 years, whatever that means. But right. So everything that maybe didn't quite seem as urgent is now super urgent. And therefore other things that were at the top of the list are now on the back burner, right? So it's sort of this constant churn, and companies have more choice than ever before. SaaS companies, I think, have, 5 years ago when they launched, they maybe only had 3 competitors, and now I think they have 10 competitors. It's easier than ever to switch vendors. So you've got to be able to find a way to stand out in that sea. So that's one thing that has definitely changed, is the buyers have even more power because there's even more choice. I think, though, in some ways, it also has become more difficult to get in front of your buyers in the traditional ways, but with creativity, right? And effort, it maybe we've even expanded our effort to be authentic. We're literally letting people into our homes now to see our background and kind of show more about our human selves than we might have in the past. We're turning on our videos when maybe before it was just an email. So there's been some unexpected upside, I think, to this kind of remote world that we're living in now when it comes to having some human connections.
So I think what you're talking about, because you and I were referring to this earlier, how it used to be a very clear separation between my personal is on Facebook and my business is on LinkedIn, and never should the two cross and mix. And that's just not the case anymore because of many of the things that you're talking about. I mean, you want to be able to create a human connection because it's still all about humans. You want to improve, your emotional intelligence. So you have to, interact and engage and understand and, therefore apply. Otherwise, you're going to run a lot of risks associated with that as far as the competition is concerned, and the disruption is going to happen to you instead of you being the disruptor. And then when I start looking at also the buying teams, they've increased, and now most of them are remote. So if I'm thinking about this transformation process, and here's the thing that you start talking and we start seeing more and more of, and it was happening before COVID, is that transformation projects fail at a miserable and disastrous rate. I mean, it's like they fail in the 85 plus percentile because it's so darn hard. Mm-hmm. So if I'm talking about being able to go from an organization that is more let's say traditional in our approach that no longer applies to today's world. I'm not breaking through. I'm not standing out. I keep trying to ride a dead horse. What is my likelihood of success in being able to transform and break through?
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, it comes, I think, to some executive leadership that is truly committed, right, to driving that change consistently and listening to people and taking in their input. If you're talking about sort of the cultural transformation as it relates to brand, I think that it can be a mistake to try to say, well, we were this buttoned up company, but now we suddenly have to be something else, right? That's a really tricky and maybe unnecessary jump that you have to make, right? Someone can't kind of just snap their fingers and change an organizational culture, and it takes a lot of time. So when you think of it more as discovery, it sometimes it's saying, oh wow, we have changed and I didn't even realize it, right? And as companies grow, just a couple of examples that I've seen is, as companies grow over time, or maybe even now remotely, have spent all this time remotely, the culture has changed, and the leadership may not even realize it. So they have to sort of, it's not about driving the transformation as much as recognizing some transformation has happened. And so we maybe can't keep doing things the same way, or we can't keep telling the same story. And we have to show that we're somehow in a different way. I mean, definitely the remote situation has changed us, but even just going from, high growth of a company, and then suddenly, maybe in the beginning you were that rebel and you were the upstart, and the David. Well, a few years later, like if now you're serving enterprise companies and you're the leader in the market, you can't be telling that same story that you were before, right? So we have to kind of check back in and say, okay, my company has changed, or now I want to now be an enterprise looking company. And so I have to make that shift, but it's a process. It's more of a, most companies don't just flip a switch and change things overnight. Most companies also don't have the budget for that kind of a thing. And it takes some time to get that buy-in and look at all the different touch points that have to change. So I think planning ahead, right, to say, okay, we're going to kind of make this change, and then we're going to move to this change, and then we're going to, ultimately this is where we're heading, can be a lot more effective for especially a large organization that has a lot of different, influencers and stakeholders that have to be brought along the way.
Well, as you're talking too, I start thinking about, really paying attention to the things that got you where you are. So if I am an organization that was that rebel startup, and I do want to now start serving enterprise organizations, maybe I maintain that rebel mindset in my, innovative group, right? Mm-hmm. And then I talk about them that way. So that way you're still keeping this nucleus of what, got you there. So I think
I love that idea. Yeah. That you're retaining some connection to your history, right? And your roots, but you're also recognizing that somehow life has moved on.
That's right. That's right. So I mean, I think ultimately what we're talking about here, though, is that it's unique to each individual organization. And it's just that it's individuals. It's, while collectively they, are made up of a bunch of people. I mean, they are representing individuals, an individual organization, because I think it's really interesting how when we're doing business with an organization and things either went well or didn't, we refer to them as an organization when it was really, John or Jane that we dealt with, right? But we say, those people are good over there. Really?
No, they're humans.
They are. But I think that's what we always have to remember and carry forward. That's for darn sure. Okay, so now let's think about budget time, right? I always like to ask this question. I have been given the blank checkbook and I can do whatever I want. So if I'm talking about breakthrough and being able to stand out, where should I be focusing my resources and my investments? I can do whatever I want. Unlimited budget.
Must be nice to work wherever you work with the unlimited budget. Well, first thing then with this unlimited budget, right? Don't not go crazy like you won the lottery and you spend it all on day one, right? So is sort of sitting down and really planning out all of the different kinds of touch points, right, that you're going to have to impact, spending that time on the planning, recognizing that sometimes those upfront steps can take that long period of time in the beginning, but then after that, everything else starts to go more smoothly, right? So when you get kind of that upfront buy-in on the, sort of what the differentiators are, what the personality is, everything else is going to go faster. So I tend to focus in the beginning stages with much more effort and kind of building that infrastructure. And then often it takes the form. I mean, this is not the only thing that's necessary, but, it's going to take your brand story is going to come to life on your website, right? Is truly your showcase to the world. I mean, no matter what business you are. So having that story come to life visually and in the copy, and both in the tone and the messages, right? It has to be right on the site. That's sort of your core big rock element that everyone internal and external points to, right? So the site, a big rock kind of amazing sales presentation, right? That is usable by your sales team. That's what is going to be taken out onto the road, right? And put in front of lots of people that may never even have, maybe they weren't the one that initially came to the website, but they're the one that's the influencer that's in the meeting. Those are sort of the two core key pieces that I start with, because I think the other sort of tangential or, supplemental pieces kind of flow from those. So I spend the time and the investment in talking with the customers, talking with, really doing the competitive research and getting everything sort of in place for your plan and your strategy at first. And then focusing on those kind of big rock assets is pays off dividends then in the end.
Margie Agin, I had fun chatting with you today. How does the B2B DM gang get in touch with you?
Best place is my website, which is Centerboard Marketing. So it's centerboard-marketing.com. But also LinkedIn is great. And I'd love to talk with your listeners or share with them a little bit more about the book and the frameworks, and really enjoyed being on the show today. Margie Agin, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.